The trade winds were gentle that afternoon in Wailea, carrying the scent of plumeria and saltwater through the open-air lobby of the Majestic Shores Resort. And when the Barrett family stepped out of their rental SUV into the November sunshine, they carried with them the exhaustion of a 6-hour flight from Seattle and the anticipation of a vacation they had been planning for 9 months. Malcolm Barrett, 47 years old, founder and CEO of Barrett Tech Solutions, a cybersecurity firm that had gone public 3 years earlier and was now valued at just over $800 million, had his arm around his wife Vanessa's shoulders as they approached the entrance. Vanessa, 44, was a pediatric surgeon at Seattle Children's Hospital, and she moved with the efficient grace of someone used to long shifts and high-stakes decisions. Behind them came their children. Zoe, 15, already scrolling through her phone to capture the palm trees and the glimpse of ocean beyond the resort's manicured grounds, and Marcus, 12, dragging a rolling suitcase that was almost as tall as he was. The family had saved this trip for Thanksgiving week, a tradition they tried to maintain despite increasingly busy schedules, and they had chosen Maui specifically because Vanessa had never been, because Malcolm had promised her something spectacular, and because the Majestic Shores Resort had been featured in Travel + Leisure's list of the world's best hotels, with its private beach and infinity pools and 5-diamond dining. The lobby was everything the website had promised. Soaring ceilings with exposed wooden beams, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific, clusters of plush furniture arranged around a central fountain where koi fish swam in lazy circles. The air was cool despite the warmth outside, maintained at a precise 72 degrees, and the floor was polished marble that reflected the afternoon light in soft, diffused patterns. A handful of guests moved through the space with the unhurried ease of people on vacation, some in resort wear, others in the kind of casual expensive clothing that signaled wealth without announcement. Malcolm had reserved the Ocean View Suite, 2 bedrooms with a shared living area, one of the mid-tier options but still running nearly $2,000 a night. The reservation had been confirmed multiple times via email, the deposit paid, the pre-arrival questionnaire filled out asking about dietary restrictions and pillow preferences and whether they wanted the minibar stocked with particular items. They approached the front desk, where 2 staff members were stationed behind a long counter of dark wood inlaid with mother-of-pearl. The woman on the left was occupied with another guest, a white couple in their 60s discussing spa appointments. The woman on the right, whose name tag read Jennifer Cosgrove in elegant script, looked up as the Barretts approached, and her smile was professional, automatic, but something in her eyes shifted when she registered them, a flicker that Malcolm caught even though it was gone in an instant. "Good afternoon," Malcolm said, setting his carry-on bag down. "We're checking in, reservation under Barrett." Jennifer's fingers moved to her keyboard, her gaze fixed on the screen, and she typed for a moment before her brow furrowed slightly. "Barrett," she repeated, as though confirming the spelling. "And what was the first name on the reservation?" "Malcolm." "Malcolm Barrett." More typing. The furrow deepened. Then Jennifer looked up, and her smile had changed, had become tighter, more careful. "I'm sorry, Mr. Barrett, but I'm not seeing a reservation under that name for today. Are you sure you have the right hotel?" The question landed with the weight of implication, and Malcolm felt Vanessa stiffen beside him. "Yes," he said, keeping his voice level. "I'm sure. The Majestic Shores Resort in Wailea. I made the reservation in February through your website. Confirmation number is in my email." He pulled out his phone, navigating to his inbox, finding the confirmation that he had checked 3 times in the last week to make sure everything was in order. Jennifer held out her hand for the phone, and Malcolm passed it over, watching as she read the screen. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but he could see the tension in her jaw, the way she glanced at her colleague as though seeking backup. "This confirmation is for the Majestic Shores," she said slowly. "But, Mr. Barrett, I have to tell you, we're fully booked this week, and I'm just not seeing your reservation in the system. Sometimes there are issues with third-party booking sites, or cancellations that don't process correctly. Are you certain you didn't receive an email about a problem with your reservation?" Malcolm felt the first real stirrings of anger, the kind that started cold in his chest and spread outward. "I didn't book through a third-party site. I booked directly through your website. And no, I didn't receive any email about a cancellation. The reservation is confirmed. The deposit is paid and we're here to check in." Zoe, sensing the shift in her father's tone, looked up from her phone, Marcus had wandered over to the fountain, oblivious, but Vanessa moved closer to Malcolm, her hand finding his arm, a silent gesture of solidarity. Jennifer typed again, her fingers moving quickly now, and then she picked up the phone at the desk, dialed an extension, and spoke in a low voice that Malcolm could not quite make out. When she hung up, she said, "I've called the manager on duty. She'll be out in just a moment to help sort this out. If you could just wait over there." She gestured to the seating area near the fountain. "She'll be with you shortly." It was not a request. It was a dismissal, polite but firm, and Malcolm understood in that moment that they were being moved away from the front desk, separated from the flow of guests who were checking in smoothly, without incident, without question. He wanted to refuse, to insist on staying at the desk until the issue was resolved, but Vanessa was already guiding Zoe toward the seating area, and Marcus had returned, looking confused, and Malcolm followed, feeling the eyes of other guests on them, the curiosity or the judgment or the indifference, he could not tell which. If you are reading this and thinking about the small ways that belonging is signaled and denied, about the assumptions that shape who is questioned and who is believed, then you understand why the Barrett family stood in that five-star lobby, feeling like intruders in a space they had every right to occupy. This is a story about what happens when those assumptions collide with people who refuse to accept them quietly, about the systems that protect those assumptions, and about the cost of demanding accountability in places where money is supposed to be the great equalizer, but where race still determines how you are seen and treated. They waited for 12 minutes, sitting on a sectional sofa upholstered in cream linen, Marcus fidgeting and asking when they could go to the beach, Zoe filming the lobby on her phone with the detached irony of a teenager who documented everything, Vanessa scrolling through her own phone with the focused intensity that meant she was upset but containing it. Malcolm watched the front desk, watched Jennifer check in 2 more parties, both white, both greeted with smiles that seemed warmer, with transactions that took less than 5 minutes from greeting to key cards handed over. He felt the anger building, felt the familiar tension between wanting to give people the benefit of the doubt and knowing from a lifetime of these moments that his instincts were probably correct. A woman emerged from a hallway behind the desk, mid-40s, white, with dark hair pulled back in a sleek bun, and a navy dress that suggested authority. She scanned the lobby, her gaze landing on the Barretts, and she approached with a smile that was polished but wary. "Mr. Barrett, I'm Diane Murphy, the assistant manager. I understand there's been some confusion with your reservation." Malcolm stood, Vanessa rising beside him. "There's no confusion on our end," Malcolm said. "We have a confirmed reservation for 5 nights in the Ocean View Suite, starting today. Your front desk staff is telling us it's not in the system, but I have the confirmation right here." He held out his phone again, and Diane took it, her eyes moving over the screen. "I see," she said, and her tone was careful, measured in a way that made Malcolm's instincts prickle. "Mr. Barrett, it looks like this reservation was made several months ago, and there's a notation here that it was flagged for verification. Sometimes when we see unusual booking patterns, we reach out to confirm that the reservation is legitimate. Did you receive a call or an email from our reservations team?" "No," Malcolm said. "I received the confirmation email, and then I received the standard pre-arrival emails. Nothing about verification or any kind of problem." Diane handed the phone back, and her smile tightened. "Well, I apologize for the inconvenience. What may have happened is that the verification request went unanswered, and the reservation was released back into inventory. It's a precaution we take to prevent fraud." Vanessa spoke up then, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Are you saying you think our reservation is fraudulent? On what basis?" Diane's expression flickered, a momentary discomfort. "Not at all, Mrs. Barrett. It's just a standard procedure. But the issue now is that we're fully booked for the week, and I don't currently have an Ocean View suite available. What I can do is offer you an alternative accommodation, perhaps at one of our sister properties, or I can see if we have any other rooms available here that might work." Malcolm felt Vanessa's hand tighten on his arm. He took a breath, forced himself to speak slowly and clearly. "Ms. Murphy, we don't want an alternative accommodation. We want the room we reserved and paid a deposit for, and I want to understand why our reservation was flagged for verification when I booked it the same way any other guest would have booked it. What made our reservation unusual?" Diane's smile disappeared entirely. "Mr. Barrett, I'm trying to help you, but if the reservation isn't in the system, I can't just conjure a room out of thin air. Now I'm happy to make some calls, see what I can do, but I need you to work with me here." "We are working with you," Vanessa said, "but we're also asking a very straightforward question. Why was our reservation flagged?" There was a pause, a moment where the question hung in the air, and Diane looked from Vanessa to Malcolm and then to the children, Zoe now filming this interaction. Her phone held at waist level, but the lens pointed directly at Diane, and something in Diane's posture shifted. "Please turn off the camera," she said to Zoe, her voice sharper now. "It's a public space," Zoe said, with the kind of teenage defiance that made Malcolm simultaneously proud and nervous. "I can record if I want to." Diane's jaw tightened, and she turned back to Malcolm. "Mr. Barrett, I'm going to need you to come with me to the back office so we can sort this out away from the lobby. It's not appropriate to have this conversation here." "Why not?" Malcolm asked. "We're guests checking in, or we should be. I don't see why we need to go to a back office." "Because," Diane said, and her voice dropped lower, became firmer, "I need to verify your identity and your payment method before I can proceed, and I'd prefer to do that in private." And there it was, the request that was not a request, the implication that there was something suspect about them, something that required verification beyond what other guests were asked to provide. Malcolm glanced at Vanessa, saw the fury in her eyes, the way she was holding herself very still, and he made a decision. "No," he said, "we're not going to a back office. If you need to verify our identity, you can do it right here. I have my driver's license. I have the credit card I used to make the reservation. I have the confirmation email. But we're not being escorted away like we're criminals." Diane's face flushed, and she looked around the lobby, clearly aware that other guests were now watching, that the interaction had become a scene. "Mr. Barrett, I'm trying to accommodate you, but if you're not willing to cooperate, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property." Vanessa laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You're going to ask us to leave? We have a confirmed reservation. We've traveled 3,000 miles, and you're threatening to have us removed because we're asking questions. Do you understand how this looks?" Diane straightened, her hand moving to the radio, clipped to her belt. "I'm going to call security if you don't calm down and work with me." "Call them," Malcolm said, his voice quiet but hard. "Call security. Call your general manager. Call whoever you need to call. Because we're not leaving until this is resolved, and I'm going to make sure that everyone who books a reservation at this resort knows that the Majestic Shores racially profiles its guests." The word hung in the air, bold and undeniable, and Diane's expression went rigid. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Barrett, and I don't appreciate—" "I don't care what you appreciate," Malcolm said, and his voice was rising now, the anger he had been holding in check beginning to break through. "I care that my family is being treated like we don't belong here, like our reservation is suspect, like we need extra verification that I guarantee you don't ask of white guests, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend that's acceptable." Jennifer, the front desk agent, had appeared at Diane's side, her expression anxious, and she whispered something to Diane that Malcolm could not hear. Diane listened, nodded, and then turned back to Malcolm. "Mr. Barrett, I've just been informed that we do have your reservation in the system. There was an error in how it was logged, and it wasn't showing up in the standard check-in queue. I apologize for the confusion. We can proceed with your check-in now." The reversal was so sudden, so complete, that for a moment Malcolm could not process it. "An error," he repeated. "Yes," Diane said, and her smile was back, forced and brittle. "A system error. It happens occasionally. If you'll come back to the desk, we'll get you checked in and get you on your way to your suite." Malcolm stared at her, trying to read the truth in her face, trying to understand whether this was a genuine mistake or whether the presence of Zoe's camera and the threat of public accusation had suddenly made the reservation reappear. He did not believe it was the former, but he also knew that pushing further in this moment would accomplish little. "Fine," he said. "Let's check in." They returned to the front desk, and Jennifer processed the check-in with a speed and efficiency that had been absent before. She verified Malcolm's ID, processed the credit card, handed over 2 key cards in small paper sleeves, embossed with the resort's logo, and explained the amenities and the location of their suite with a brightness that felt performative, desperate. The entire process took 4 minutes. When it was done, Malcolm took the key cards, thanked Jennifer with a coolness that conveyed nothing, and turned to his family. "Let's go," he said. They followed a bellman to the elevator, rode up to the fourth floor in silence, and walked down a hallway lined with artwork depicting Hawaiian landscapes and sea turtles. The suite, when they entered it, was stunning. A spacious living room with a wall of glass doors opening onto a balcony, 2 bedrooms with king and queen beds, a bathroom with a soaking tub and a rain shower, a kitchenette stocked with the items they had requested. The view from the balcony was everything they had hoped for, the ocean stretching out in shades of turquoise and sapphire, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting golden light across the water. But none of it felt the way it should have. Vanessa stood on the balcony, arms crossed, staring out at the ocean, and Malcolm knew she was furious, knew that the beauty of the view was not enough to erase the humiliation of what had just happened. Zoe had thrown herself onto the couch in the living room, her phone in her hand, and Marcus was exploring the bedrooms, oblivious to the tension. Malcolm joined Vanessa on the balcony, stood beside her in silence for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Vanessa turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You don't have anything to be sorry for. This is on them." "But Malcolm, what are we going to do? Are we just going to stay here for 5 days and pretend that didn't happen? Are we going to smile and tip the staff and play along like we weren't just treated like we were trying to scam our way into a hotel room?" Malcolm did not have an answer. He felt the same conflict, the same exhaustion. "I don't know," he said. "Let me think about it. Let me figure out what the right move is." Vanessa nodded, wiped at her eyes, and then turned back to the view. They stood together in the fading light, and Malcolm thought about the vacation they had planned, the snorkeling and the luau's and the family time they had been looking forward to, and he wondered how much of that could be salvaged, how much had already been ruined by the 15 minutes in the lobby downstairs. That evening, after they had unpacked and ordered room service because no one felt like navigating the resort's restaurants, Malcolm sat on the balcony with his laptop and began to document everything. He wrote down the timeline, the names of the staff members, the exact words that had been spoken as best as he could remember. He found the confirmation email, took screenshots, saved them to a folder. He searched for reviews of the Majestic Shores Resort, looking for any mention of discrimination or profiling, and found a few scattered complaints, mostly from Black and Asian guests, describing similar experiences, being questioned about payment, having reservations lost, being assumed to be in the wrong place. Vanessa joined him after getting the kids settled, and she read over his shoulder. "What are you going to do with this?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Malcolm said, "but I want to have it all in one place, in case we decide to file a complaint or go public. I just need to think about what the best approach is." Vanessa sat down beside him, pulled her knees up to her chest. "I've been thinking about it too. And Malcolm, I don't want to spend this vacation fighting. I don't want to ruin the time we have with the kids, the time we've been looking forward to. But I also don't want to let this go. I don't want to just accept that this is how things are." Malcolm closed the laptop, reached for her hand. "Neither do I. So here's what I'm thinking. We stay. We try to enjoy the vacation as much as we can, but we also document everything. If there are more incidents, if we're treated differently in the restaurants or at the pool or anywhere else, we note it. And then, when we get home, we decide what to do. We file a complaint, we contact the corporate office, we consider going public. But we do it strategically, not in the heat of the moment when we're still processing what happened." Vanessa considered this, then nodded. "Okay, I can live with that. But Malcolm, if they do anything else, if there's one more incident, I'm not waiting until we get home. I'm calling them out right then and there." "Deal," Malcolm said. They sat together in the warm night air, listening to the sound of the waves below, and tried to find some of the peace they had come here for. It was not easy, and the anger and the hurt were still there, simmering beneath the surface, but they held on to each other and tried to believe that the rest of the trip could be different, could be what they had hoped for. The next morning, Malcolm woke early, the time difference and the noise of unfamiliar birdsong pulling him out of sleep. Vanessa was still asleep beside him, and the suite was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. He got up, made coffee in the kitchenette, and took his cup out to the balcony, where the sun was just beginning to rise over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. He thought about the day ahead, the plan to take the kids snorkeling at Molokini Crater, the boat tour they had booked months ago. He thought about whether he could let go of the anger from yesterday, whether he could be present for his family, whether he could separate the beauty of this place from the ugliness of how they had been treated. He wanted to believe he could, But he also knew himself well enough to know that the anger was not going to disappear just because he willed it to. His phone buzzed with a text from his brother Terence, who lived in Los Angeles, and who Malcolm had told about the trip. The text read, "You guys make it to Maui okay? How's the resort?" Malcolm hesitated, then typed back, "We're here. Resort is beautiful. Had some issues at check-in, but we're sorted now. I'll fill you in later." Terence's response came quickly. "Issues like what? Everything okay?" Malcolm sighed, typed, "They lost our reservation or claimed they did. Treated us like we were at the wrong hotel. Got pretty tense, but they eventually found it. I'll tell you the whole story when we're back." "Terence? Man, I'm sorry, that's BS. You want me to make some calls?" "I know people in hospitality." Malcolm, "Not yet. Just seeing how the rest of the trip goes. But thanks." They exchanged a few more messages, and then Malcolm put the phone down and finished his coffee, watching the sun climb higher, feeling the warmth begin to spread across the balcony. By the time the rest of the family woke up, he had decided to commit to the day, to focus on making good memories, to let the incident from yesterday sit in the background rather than dominating the foreground. The snorkeling trip was spectacular. The boat was clean and well-staffed, the guides were friendly and knowledgeable, and the water at Molokini was so clear they could see the coral and the fish from the surface before even putting their masks on. Zoe and Marcus were thrilled, pointing out sea turtles and schools of tropical fish, and Vanessa relaxed in a way Malcolm had not seen in months, her laughter genuine and unguarded. For a few hours, it felt like the vacation they had imagined, and Malcolm allowed himself to believe that maybe the rest of the week would be like this, that the incident at check-in had been an anomaly, an unfortunate start, but not a pattern. But that belief began to fracture that evening when they went to dinner at the resort's signature restaurant, a fine dining establishment called Azure that required reservations and had a dress code. Malcolm had made the reservation weeks ago, had received a confirmation, and they had dressed accordingly. Malcolm in slacks and a linen shirt, Vanessa in a sundress that was elegant without being formal, Zoe in a skirt and blouse, Marcus in khakis and a polo. They arrived at the restaurant at 7, gave their name to the hostess and waited. The hostess, a young white woman with blonde hair pulled into a high ponytail, scanned her reservation list, frowned, and looked up. "I'm sorry. I'm not seeing a reservation under Barrett for this evening." Malcolm felt his stomach drop. "I made the reservation 3 weeks ago. I have the confirmation email." The hostess smiled apologetically. "I believe you, but it's not showing in the system. Let me check with my manager." She disappeared into the back, and Malcolm glanced at Vanessa, saw the set of her jaw, the way her hands were clenched at her sides. "Not again," Vanessa said quietly. "Maybe it's a coincidence," Malcolm said, though he did not believe it. "Malcolm, come on, this is a pattern." The hostess returned with a man in a suit, mid-30s, with dark hair and a smile that was friendly but professional. "Mr. Barrett, I'm Kevin Tanaka, the restaurant manager. I understand there's an issue with your reservation." "Yes," Malcolm said, pulling out his phone and navigating to the confirmation email. "I have a reservation for 4 at 7. Here's the confirmation." Kevin took the phone, studied the screen, and then handed it back. "I see, it looks like this reservation was made through the resort's concierge, rather than directly with the restaurant, and sometimes those don't sync properly with our system. I apologize for the confusion. Let me see what I can do." He stepped away, conferred with the hostess, and then returned. "Mr. Barrett, we're fully booked tonight, and I don't have a table available right now, but if you're willing to wait, I can probably get you seated within the next hour. Alternatively, I can offer you a reservation for tomorrow night, same time, with a complimentary appetizer for the inconvenience." Malcolm felt the anger rising again, sharp and hot. "We're not willing to wait an hour. We have 2 kids who are hungry, and we made this reservation weeks ago. This is the second time since we arrived that a reservation has disappeared. What's going on?" Kevin's expression became more guarded. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Barrett, but reservations do sometimes fall through the cracks, especially when they're made through third parties or concierge services. It's not personal, it's just a system issue." "Is it?" Vanessa asked, stepping forward. "Because it's starting to feel very personal. We check in and our room reservation is lost. We try to have dinner and our restaurant reservation is lost. Are you telling me this happens to all your guests, or just to us?" Kevin's smile disappeared. "Mrs. Barrett, I assure you this is not about you personally. It's an unfortunate coincidence." "I don't believe in coincidences," Vanessa said, "and I don't believe you'd be having this conversation with us if we were white." The accusation landed like a slap, and Kevin's face flushed. "That's not fair. We treat all our guests equally." "Do you?" Malcolm said. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like we're being treated very differently, and I'm going to document every single instance, and I'm going to make sure your corporate office knows exactly what's happening here." Kevin took a step back, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mr. Barrett, let me see if I can find a solution. Just give me a few minutes." He disappeared again, and the Barretts stood in the restaurant's entrance, aware of the other diners glancing at them, aware that they were making a scene, aware that they were being positioned as difficult guests rather than guests with legitimate complaints. Zoe had her phone out again, filming discreetly, and Marcus looked confused and uncomfortable, tugging on Vanessa's hand and asking if they could just go somewhere else. Kevin returned with a different offer. "Mr. Barrett, I can seat you in our private dining room, which is normally reserved for larger parties. It's available tonight, and I can have you seated immediately. Would that work?" It was a concession, an attempt to resolve the situation, but it also felt like they were being segregated, moved away from the main dining room where their presence might cause discomfort or questions. Malcolm looked at Vanessa, saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the calculation of whether this fight was worth it in this moment, and he made a decision. "Fine," he said. "We'll take it." The private dining room was beautiful, elegant, with a view of the ocean and enough space for a party of 12. It felt absurd to have the four of them seated in a room meant for so many, but the food was excellent, the service attentive, and by the time they finished dinner, some of the tension had eased. But as they walked back to their suite, Malcolm knew that the vacation had been irrevocably changed, that they were now in a different mode, one of vigilance and documentation rather than relaxation and enjoyment. If you are following this story and recognizing the patterns, the ways that assumptions about who belongs in luxury spaces shape interactions and access, then you understand why the Barretts spent that night in their suite, talking about whether to stay or to leave, whether to continue fighting or to cut their losses and find peace somewhere else. These are the calculations that black families make in spaces that were not built for them, the constant negotiation between standing your ground and protecting your own peace. And if this resonates with you, if you see yourself or your loved ones in this story, then consider sharing it, letting it be part of the larger conversation about who is welcomed and who is merely tolerated. By the third day of the vacation, the Barretts had developed a rhythm. They focused on activities that took them away from the resort: a road trip to Hana, a visit to Haleakala National Park, time on beaches that were public rather than private, where they could exist without the weight of scrutiny. But they returned to the resort each evening, and each return brought new instances of differential treatment that were small individually but accumulated into a pattern impossible to ignore. At the pool, a staff member asked Malcolm if he was a guest of the resort, despite the wristband he was wearing that clearly identified him as such. At the spa, where Vanessa had a massage appointment, she was asked to prepay despite the charges being set up to go to their room. At breakfast in the oceanfront restaurant, they were seated near the kitchen despite arriving early and requesting a table with a view, while white families who arrived after them were given prime spots without question. Each incident, taken alone, could be explained away. The pool attendant might have been new, might not have recognized the wristbands. The spa might have had issues with room charges not processing. The restaurant might have been managing reservations according to some internal logic that had nothing to do with race. But taken together, the pattern was undeniable, and by the fourth day, Malcolm and Vanessa had amassed a file of documentation: photos, videos, time-stamped notes, copies of confirmations and receipts. Zoe, who had initially been filming out of teenage reflex, had become invested in the project, her sense of justice activated, and she had captured several interactions that Malcolm and Vanessa had not even noticed at the time. On the fifth and final night of their stay, Malcolm made a decision. He called the resort's main office and asked to speak with the general manager. He was told that the general manager, a man named Richard Caldwell, was off-site, but would be available the following morning before their checkout. Malcolm made an appointment for 9 a.m., and then he spent the evening preparing, organizing his documentation, drafting a statement that was clear and factual and impossible to dismiss. Vanessa watched him work, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, and finally said, What do you want to get out of this? An apology? Compensation? Policy changes? Malcolm looked up from his laptop. Honestly, I want them to acknowledge what happened. I want them to admit that we were profiled, that we were treated differently, and I want them to commit to changes that will prevent it from happening to other families. And if they're not willing to do that, then I want to take this public. You know that if we go public, it's going to blow up, Vanessa said. People are going to have opinions, some of them awful. We're going to be accused of playing the race card, of being difficult, of trying to get free stuff. Are you ready for that? Are you? Malcolm asked. Vanessa took a sip of her wine, considered the question. I think so. I'm tired of staying quiet. I'm tired of protecting the feelings of people who don't care about ours. And I think Zoe and Marcus need to see that we don't just accept this kind of treatment, that we push back even when it's hard. Malcolm nodded. Okay, then let's see what Caldwell says tomorrow. If he's willing to engage, to take it seriously, maybe we can resolve it without going public. But if he's defensive or dismissive, then we document the meeting and we take it from there. They went to bed that night with a plan, and Malcolm slept better than he had since they arrived, the clarity of purpose replacing some of the anger and frustration that had been eating at him all week. The meeting with Richard Caldwell took place in a conference room adjacent to the resort's executive offices, a space designed for VIP guests and business travelers, with its polished table and ergonomic chairs and a wall of windows overlooking the resort's grounds. Caldwell was in his late 50s, white with silver hair and a tan that suggested a life spent in tropical climates. He greeted Malcolm and Vanessa with a firm handshake and a smile that was warm but cautious, and he gestured for them to sit. Mr. and Mrs. Barrett, thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I understand you've had some concerns during your stay, and I want to hear about them directly. Malcolm had decided to let Vanessa take the lead, knowing that her calm, clinical manner would be more effective than his barely contained anger. Vanessa opened her laptop, pulled up the file they had prepared, and began to walk through the incidents one by one with dates and times and names. She showed Caldwell the screenshots of confirmations, the videos Zoe had taken, the notes they had compiled. She spoke in the measured tone of a surgeon presenting a case study, factual and unemotional, and Caldwell listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as the recitation went on. When Vanessa finished, there was a long silence. Then Caldwell said, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. Some of what you've described sounds like legitimate system errors, the kind of thing that can happen in a large resort with multiple booking platforms. But I also hear your concern that the errors seem to have disproportionately affected your family, and that some of the interactions you've had with staff have been less than welcoming. I want to assure you that discrimination is not tolerated at this resort, and if any of our staff have treated you unfairly, I will address it. With respect, Mr. Caldwell, Malcolm said, we're not just talking about a few bad apples, we're talking about a pattern. Every reservation we made was questioned or lost. Every interaction we had involved some level of scrutiny that we did not see applied to other guests, and when we raised concerns, we were dismissed or placated rather than heard. That's not just about individual staff members, that's about the culture of this resort. Caldwell shifted in his chair, his expression becoming more guarded. I understand why you might feel that way, but I can tell you that we have policies in place to ensure equal treatment of all guests. We do diversity training, we have complaint procedures, we take these issues seriously. But I can't simply accept that the resort as a whole is discriminatory based on your experience, however frustrating it may have been. Vanessa leaned forward. Mr. Caldwell, we're not asking you to take our word for it. We're asking you to investigate. Review the footage from your security cameras. Check the reservation logs. Interview the staff who interacted with us. Look at the pattern and tell us whether you think it's normal for a family to have this many issues in a 5-day stay. And if you find that there were errors or bias, we're asking you to acknowledge it and to take concrete steps to address it. Caldwell was quiet for a moment, his hands folded on the table. Then he said, I can commit to reviewing what happened during your stay. I can commit to speaking with the staff involved and ensuring that they understand our standards. And I can offer you a full refund for your stay, along with a complimentary return visit, as a gesture of goodwill. It was a significant offer financially, but Malcolm and Vanessa exchanged a glance and both knew it was not enough. We don't want a refund or a free stay, Malcolm said. We want accountability. We want you to acknowledge that we were treated unfairly and we want to see changes that will prevent this from happening to other families." Caldwell's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Barrett, I'm offering you a substantial compensation package. I'm committing to an internal review. I don't know what more you expect from me." "We expect you to admit that this resort has a problem with how it treats black guests," Vanessa said, her voice still calm but with an edge now. "We expect you to take responsibility, rather than hiding behind policies and procedures and offers of money. And if you're not willing to do that, then we're going to make sure that people know what happened here." Caldwell stood, signaling that the meeting was over. "I'm sorry you feel that way. I've made you a fair offer, and if you choose not to accept it, that's your prerogative. But I would caution you against making public accusations that could be damaging to the resort's reputation. We have legal resources, and we will defend ourselves if necessary." It was a threat, thinly veiled, and Malcolm felt the anger surge. He stood as well, meeting Caldwell's gaze. "Are you threatening us?" "I'm simply informing you of the reality," Caldwell said. "Defamation is a serious matter, and if you make false claims about this resort, there will be consequences." Malcolm wanted to respond, wanted to tell Caldwell exactly what he thought of the threat. But Vanessa put a hand on his arm and said, "We're done here. Thank you for your time, Mr. Caldwell." They left the conference room, walked through the resort's elegant corridors in silence, and returned to their suite to finish packing. The checkout was swift and uneventful, and as they loaded their luggage into the rental SUV and drove away from the majestic Shores resort, Malcolm felt a strange mixture of relief and unfinished business. The vacation was over, but the fight, he knew, was just beginning. On the flight back to Seattle, Malcolm and Vanessa talked about next steps. They agreed to file a formal complaint with the resort's corporate office, which was based in Chicago, and managed a portfolio of luxury properties across the country. They also agreed to reach out to a civil rights attorney to understand their legal options, and they agreed that if the corporate response was inadequate, they would go public, using their documentation and their platform to tell their story. Zoe, sitting across the aisle with her headphones on, was scrolling through the footage she had captured on her phone, and Marcus was asleep, his head against the window. Vanessa looked at them and said quietly, "I hate that they had to experience this. I hate that we couldn't just have a normal vacation." "I know," Malcolm said, "but maybe there's something valuable in them seeing us stand up for ourselves. In them learning that you don't just accept mistreatment because it's easier or because you don't want to make a scene." Vanessa nodded, leaned her head on his shoulder. "I hope you're right." When they landed in Seattle, Malcolm felt the familiar pull of routine, of work and responsibilities, and the life they had built. But he also felt a new resolve, a determination to see this through, to make sure that what had happened to them mattered, that it became part of a larger reckoning with how luxury hospitality treated black guests. Over the next week, Malcolm and Vanessa filed their formal complaint, a 10-page document that detailed every incident, included timestamps and supporting evidence, and requested a substantive response from the corporate office. They sent it via email and certified mail, ensuring there was a paper trail. They also reached out to an attorney named Sandra Williams, who specialized in civil rights and discrimination cases, and who agreed to review their documentation and advise on potential legal action. Sandra was in her early 50s, black, with a reputation for taking on powerful defendants and winning. She met with Malcolm and Vanessa in her office in downtown Seattle, reviewed the materials they had compiled, and listened to their account of the vacation. When they finished, she sat back in her chair and said, "You have a strong case. The pattern is clear, the documentation is thorough, and the threats from the general manager are concerning. You have several options. You could file a lawsuit for discrimination and emotional distress. You could file complaints with state and federal agencies that oversee hospitality and civil rights. Or you could go public and use media pressure to force the resort to respond. Each approach has pros and cons." "What do you recommend?" Malcolm asked. Sandra considered. "I'd recommend a multi-pronged approach. File the complaints with the agencies, which establishes a formal record and can lead to investigations. Pursue media coverage, which creates public pressure and can force the resort's hand. And hold the lawsuit option in reserve as leverage if they're not willing to settle or make meaningful changes. But Malcolm, Vanessa, you need to be prepared for this to be a long process. Discrimination cases are hard to prove. Corporations have deep pockets and good lawyers, and the public response can be brutal." "We understand," Vanessa said, "but we're ready." Sandra nodded. Okay. Then let's start with the agencies. I'll help you draft the complaints and we'll get those filed within the next week. In the meantime, think about whether you want to do media. If you do, I can connect you with journalists who cover these issues. But once you go public, there's no taking it back. Malcolm and Vanessa left the meeting with a plan, and over the next several days, they worked with Sandra to file complaints with the Washington State Human Rights Commission and the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. The complaints were detailed, citing both the specific incidents at the Majestic Shores and the broader pattern of discrimination in the luxury hospitality industry. Sandra also helped them draft a press release, which they held in reserve, waiting to see how the resort's corporate office would respond to their initial complaint. The response came 3 weeks later, a letter from the corporate legal team. It was brief, polite, and non-committal. The letter acknowledged receipt of the complaint, stated that the company took such matters seriously, and indicated that an internal review would be conducted. It did not acknowledge wrongdoing, did not offer an apology, and did not commit to any specific changes. It was, in Sandra's assessment, a holding pattern, a delay tactic designed to see if the Barretts would lose steam or accept a quiet settlement. Malcolm read the letter, felt the frustration rise, and made a decision. We're going public. Sandra had connected them with a journalist named Michael Chen, who worked for the Seattle Times and had covered several high-profile discrimination cases. Michael was interested in the story, had reviewed the documentation, and was prepared to write a feature that would run in the paper's Sunday edition. Malcolm and Vanessa agreed to go on the record, to be photographed, to let their story be told with their names and faces attached. It was a risk, but they felt it was necessary. The article was published on the first Sunday in January under the headline, "Seattle Family Says Luxury Maui Resort Racially Profiled Them Throughout Vacation." It was thorough, detailed, and accompanied by excerpts from the videos Zoe had taken, photos of the resort, and statements from Sandra Williams and from a hospitality industry expert who confirmed that the pattern described by the Barretts was consistent with racial profiling. The article also included a response from the Majestic Shores corporate office, a brief statement that reiterated their commitment to equal treatment and stated that they were conducting a review. The story was picked up quickly by other outlets. By midday, it was trending on social media, shared by activists and influencers, and people who had their own stories of being profiled in luxury spaces. The hashtag Justice for the Barretts began to circulate, and people posted about their own experiences, creating a thread of testimony that stretched across platforms and geographies. The story resonated particularly in the Black community, where the Barretts' experience was seen as emblematic of a larger truth, that wealth did not insulate you from racism, that access to luxury spaces did not guarantee respect or dignity, that the markers of success that were supposed to open doors could still be questioned and dismissed. The response was not universally supportive. Some commenters accused the Barretts of overreacting, of looking for reasons to claim discrimination, of trying to get attention or compensation. A few suggested that the resort staff had simply been doing their jobs, that verification procedures were normal, that Malcolm and Vanessa were playing the victim. But those voices were outnumbered by the chorus of people who recognized the pattern, who had lived through similar experiences, who understood that the Barretts' story was not about a few isolated incidents, but about a system that treated Black bodies as out of place in spaces of wealth and privilege. Malcolm and Vanessa watched the response unfold from their home in Seattle, feeling overwhelmed by the volume and intensity of it. Malcolm's phone rang constantly with calls from friends and colleagues and reporters wanting to interview him. Vanessa received messages from other Black physicians who shared their own stories of being profiled in hospitals and medical conferences. Zoe's video footage was viewed hundreds of thousands of times, and she found herself in the surreal position of being recognized by classmates and strangers who had seen the story. The pressure on the Majestic Shores Resort and its parent company, Prestige Hospitality Group, intensified. Within days, several travel influencers and bloggers announced they would be boycotting the resort and the company's other properties until the allegations were addressed. A few corporate clients canceled planned events, citing concerns about the company's values, and the company's stock price, which was publicly traded, dipped slightly as investors reacted to the negative publicity. 1 week after the article was published, Prestige Hospitality Group issued a more substantive statement. The company's CEO, a woman named Margaret Hendricks, announced that the Majestic Shores Resort would be undergoing a comprehensive review of its policies and practices, that all staff would be required to complete anti-bias training, and that the company was committed to ensuring that all guests were treated with respect and dignity. She also extended a personal apology to the Barrett family, stating that their experience was unacceptable and did not reflect the company's values. It was a stronger response than the initial letter, but it still felt incomplete to Malcolm and Vanessa. There was no acknowledgement of a systemic problem, no commitment to transparency about the findings of the review, no concrete steps beyond training that the company would take to prevent future incidents. Sandra advised them that this was typical of corporate crisis management, that companies would admit to individual failures without acknowledging institutional issues, and that further pressure would be needed to force real accountability. That pressure came from an unexpected source. A former employee of the Majestic Shores Resort, a housekeeper named Leilani Kahali, who had worked there for 5 years before being laid off during the pandemic, reached out to Malcolm through social media. Her message was brief and carefully worded. "I saw your story. I worked at that resort for years, and what happened to you is not new. If you want to know more, I'm willing to talk." Malcolm forwarded the message to Sandra, who arranged a video call with Leilani. What Leilani shared was illuminating and damning. She described a culture at the resort where staff were informally trained to scrutinize Black and Asian guests more carefully, to verify their reservations and payment methods, to report concerns to management if guests seemed out of place. She said that managers had never explicitly said the policies were about race, but the intent was clear, communicated through comments and jokes and the patterns of who was questioned and who was not. She also said that when staff members, particularly those who were themselves people of color, raised concerns about the differential treatment, they were told they were being too sensitive or were risking their jobs by creating problems. Leilani had documentation, text messages from former co-workers, notes from staff meetings, and photos of internal memos that outlined security procedures that, while facially neutral, were applied in ways that targeted guests of color. She was willing to share these materials publicly, but she was also afraid, worried about retaliation, about being blacklisted in the hospitality industry, about the risk to her livelihood. Sandra assured Leilani that they could protect her identity if necessary, that there were legal protections for whistleblowers, and that her testimony could be the key to proving that the discrimination Malcolm and Vanessa had experienced was part of a systemic pattern. Leilani agreed to cooperate, and over the next several days, Sandra and her team worked to compile and verify the materials she provided. The new evidence was explosive. Sandra reached out to Michael Chen at the Seattle Times, who published a follow-up article that included Leilani's testimony and excerpts from the internal documents. The article, headlined, "Former Employee Says Maui Resort Had Culture of Racial Profiling," provided corroboration for the Barrett's claims and suggested that the issues went far deeper than a few isolated incidents. It also raised questions about whether Prestige Hospitality Group's other properties had similar problems, and whether the company's diversity and inclusion initiatives were merely performative. The response was immediate and intense. Civil rights organizations called for boycotts of all Prestige Hospitality Group properties. Several high-profile celebrities and business leaders who had relationships with the company issued statements distancing themselves and calling for accountability. The company's stock price dropped more significantly, and financial analysts began to question whether the reputational damage would affect the company's long-term profitability. If you have been following this story, if you have seen how the small indignities and assumptions compound into something larger, something that demands a response, then you understand why the Barretts' decision to go public mattered. It was not just about their experience, but about the countless other families who had been treated the same way and had not had the resources or the platform to fight back. And if this resonates with you, if you see yourself or your community in this story, then consider sharing it, talking about it, letting it be part of the larger conversation about justice and accountability in spaces that claim to be open to all. Prestige Hospitality Group, facing mounting pressure, took more decisive action. Margaret Hendricks, the CEO, held a press conference in which she acknowledged that the company had failed to live up to its stated values, that there had been systemic issues with how guests of color were treated, and that the company was committed to making significant changes. She announced the immediate termination of Richard Caldwell, the general manager of the Majestic Shores Resort, as well as the assistant manager, Diane Murphy. She also announced the creation of an independent review board to examine the company's practices across all its properties, the hiring of a chief diversity officer, and the implementation of mandatory quarterly audits to ensure compliance with anti-discrimination policies. It was the most substantive response the Barretts had received, and it came not from a sense of moral obligation, but from the reality that the company's reputation and bottom line were at stake. Malcolm and Vanessa watched the press conference with mixed feelings. It was progress, yes, but it was also incomplete, reactive, driven by crisis rather than principle. Sandra advised them that they were in a strong position to negotiate a settlement, that the company would likely want to resolve the matter quickly, to stop the bleeding of negative publicity. But Malcolm and Vanessa were not primarily interested in money. They wanted commitments, transparency, ongoing accountability. They wanted to ensure that the changes the company was promising would actually be implemented and sustained. Over the next several weeks, Sandra negotiated with Prestige Hospitality Group's legal team, and a settlement was reached. The settlement included a financial component, a significant sum that Malcolm and Vanessa immediately pledged to organizations working on racial justice and hospitality industry reform. But more importantly, the settlement included binding commitments from the company, annual public reporting on diversity metrics and guest satisfaction broken down by race, ongoing monitoring by the Independent Review Board, and the establishment of a fund to support training and education for hospitality workers on bias and discrimination. The settlement was announced publicly, and it was framed by both sides as a step toward accountability and change. The Barretts issued a statement thanking the people who had supported them, acknowledging Leilani Kahali's courage in coming forward, and expressing hope that the reforms would make a real difference. Prestige Hospitality Group issued its own statement, reiterating its commitment to creating a welcoming environment for all guests and acknowledging that there was work to be done. But the story did not end there. Over the next several months, the changes at Prestige Hospitality Group were scrutinized by media, by activists, and by guests. The company published its first diversity report, which showed that while progress had been made, significant disparities remained in how guests of color were treated and how staff of color were represented in leadership roles. The Independent Review Board issued quarterly updates, some of which highlighted ongoing issues and areas where the company was falling short. Malcolm and Vanessa stayed involved, working with Sandra and with advocacy organizations to monitor the company's progress and to push for continued accountability. They also used their platform to highlight other cases of discrimination in luxury hospitality, lending their voices and their resources to families who were fighting similar battles. It was exhausting work, emotionally and practically, and there were times when they wondered whether it was worth the cost. But they also saw the impact, the policy changes at other resorts, the conversations happening in boardrooms and training sessions, the shift in awareness about how race shaped access to and experience in luxury spaces. Zoe, who had been 15 when the Maui trip happened, was now 17 and applying to colleges. She wrote her application essay about the experience, about what it had taught her about justice and courage, and the importance of using your privilege and platform to advocate for change. She was accepted to her top choice, a prestigious university with a strong program in social justice and media, and she told her parents that she wanted to continue the work they had started, to use her education to fight systemic racism in whatever field she chose. Marcus, now 14, had processed the experience differently. He was quieter about it, more internal, but Malcolm noticed that he paid attention to how people were treated, that he called out unfairness when he saw it, that he had developed a sense of justice that was sharp and uncompromising. Malcolm was proud of both his children, proud that they had not been broken by the experience, but had been shaped by it, had learned lessons that would stay with them for life. 2 years after the Maui trip, the Barretts were invited to speak at a conference on diversity and inclusion in the hospitality industry. The conference was held in Chicago, and it brought together hotel executives, advocacy groups, academics, and policymakers to discuss how to create more equitable and welcoming spaces for all guests. Malcolm and Vanessa presented their story, showed the documentation and the videos, and talked about the systemic issues that had shaped their experience. They also talked about what had worked in pushing for accountability, the combination of legal action, media pressure, and coalition building that had forced Prestige Hospitality Group to respond. The response from the audience was overwhelmingly positive, but there were also skeptics, executives who questioned whether the focus on individual cases of discrimination was the most effective way to drive change, who worried that the negative publicity was harming the industry as a whole. Malcolm addressed those concerns head-on, saying, "If the industry is harmed by stories of discrimination, then the problem is not the stories. The problem is the discrimination, and the solution is not to silence the victims, it's to fix the systems that allow discrimination to happen in the first place." The comment was met with applause, and after the panel, several executives approached Malcolm and Vanessa to talk about how their own companies could do better. Some were genuine, motivated by a real desire to change. Others were clearly motivated by fear of becoming the next Prestige Hospitality Group, the next company whose name became synonymous with racial profiling. But either way, the conversation was happening, and that was progress. One evening during the conference, Malcolm and Vanessa had dinner with Leilani Kahali, who had flown in from Hawaii to attend. Leilani had become an advocate herself, working with a labor organization to push for better protections for hospitality workers and to create channels for reporting discrimination and retaliation. She thanked Malcolm and Vanessa for including her in the fight, for making sure her story was heard, and for using their platform to amplify the voices of workers who often went unseen. "I think about that resort sometimes," Leilani said over dinner, "about whether things have really changed there, or whether they just got better at hiding the discrimination. I want to believe it's the former, but I'm not sure. I think it's probably a mix," Vanessa said. "Some people there genuinely learned from what happened and are trying to do better. Others are just going through the motions. But the fact that there's oversight now, that there are consequences for not following through, that matters. It's not perfect, but it's better than it was." Leilani nodded. "I hope you're right, and I hope what happened with you all makes it easier for the next family and the one after that." "That's the goal," Malcolm said. "We can't fix everything, but we can make it a little bit better. And if enough people do that, then maybe eventually we get to a place where these stories are rare instead of common." They finished dinner and said their goodbyes, and Malcolm and Vanessa walked back to their hotel through the Chicago evening, the city alive with lights and sounds, and the energy of a place that was constantly moving, constantly changing. And Malcolm thought about the journey they had been on, from that first moment in the Majestic Shores lobby, when they had been told they were at the wrong hotel, through the anger and the fight and the months of advocacy, to this moment, standing in another city, having made some small difference in how the world worked. It was not the vacation they had planned, not the experience they had hoped for, but it had become something else, something that mattered in ways they had not anticipated. And as they walked, Vanessa reached for Malcolm's hand and said, "Do you ever regret it? Speaking out? Going through all of this?" Malcolm thought about it, thought about the stress and the scrutiny and the toll it had taken on their family. But he also thought about Zoe's college essay, about Marcus's sense of justice, about the policy changes and the conversations and the other families who had reached out to say that the Barrett story had given them the courage to tell their own. "No," he said, "I don't regret it. I wish it hadn't been necessary, but I don't regret fighting back." Vanessa squeezed his hand. "Me neither." They walked on through the city, and the story continued, as stories do, unfolding in the lives of the people it touched, in the policies it changed, in the conversations it sparked. It was not a perfect story, not one with a neat resolution or a happy ending where everything was fixed and everyone lived happily ever after. But it was a story of resistance, of refusal to accept the unacceptable, of using voice and platform and privilege to push for something better. And that, Malcolm and Vanessa had come to understand, was enough. The years that followed brought continued evolution, both in the hospitality industry and in the Barrett family's own lives. Prestige Hospitality Group published its annual diversity reports, and while the metrics showed slow progress, they also revealed ongoing challenges. The percentage of guests of color who reported positive experiences increased, but disparities remained. The representation of people of color in management and executive roles grew, but not at the pace that advocates had hoped for. The Independent Review Board continued its work, issuing reports that were sometimes critical, sometimes praising, always pushing for more transparency and accountability. Other luxury hospitality companies, watching what had happened to Prestige Hospitality Group, began to implement their own reforms. Some were proactive, genuinely committed to creating more equitable environments. Others were reactive, motivated by fear of becoming the next viral story. But either way, the industry was changing, and the Barrett story was part of the catalyst for that change. Malcolm continued to run Barrett Tech Solutions, growing the company and using his position to advocate for diversity in the tech sector. He served on boards, mentored young black entrepreneurs, and donated to organizations working on criminal justice reform and educational equity. Vanessa continued her work as a surgeon, becoming the chief of pediatric surgery at Seattle Children's Hospital and using her platform to advocate for health equity and access to care for underserved communities. Zoe graduated from college with honors. Her thesis focused on media representation and racial justice. She took a job at a non-profit that worked on corporate accountability, investigating companies for discriminatory practices and pushing for reforms. Her experience with the Maui trip had become the foundation of her career, the thing that had shown her the power of documentation, storytelling, and strategic advocacy. Marcus, now in high school, was exploring his own interests, considering careers in law or social work. He talked sometimes about the Maui trip, about how it had changed the way he saw the world, about how it had taught him that standing up for what was right often came with a cost but was worth it. 3 years after the Maui trip, the Barrett family took another vacation, this time to the Bahamas. They chose a resort carefully, reading reviews, checking its diversity record, reaching out to other black travelers for recommendations. When they arrived, they were greeted warmly, checked in smoothly, and treated throughout their stay with the respect and care that should be standard for all guests. It was, in many ways, an unremarkable vacation, and that was exactly what made it remarkable. They were able to relax, to enjoy the beach and the food and the time together, without the constant vigilance, without the expectation of being questioned or profiled. On the last evening of the trip, they sat together on the beach, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Zoe took a photo, posted it to her social media with the caption, "A vacation where we were just a family, not a story. Progress." The post got thousands of likes, and the comments were full of people sharing their own experiences, thanking the Barretts for the work they had done, expressing hope that one day all families could vacation without fear of discrimination. Malcolm read some of the comments, felt the weight of what they represented, the collective desire for a world where race did not determine how you were treated, where access to beauty and luxury and rest was truly equitable. He knew that world was still far off, that the work was ongoing, that there would be more fights and more stories and more families who would have to make the choice between silence and speaking out. But sitting there on the beach with his family, feeling the warm sand beneath his feet and the cool breeze on his face, Malcolm allowed himself to feel a sense of accomplishment, of having contributed to something larger than himself. The Maui trip had been painful, infuriating, exhausting, but it had also been transformative, not just for his family, but for the many people whose lives had been touched by the story, by the fight, by the changes that had followed. Vanessa leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and said, "This is nice." "Yeah," Malcolm said, "it is." And for that moment, that was enough. 5 years after the Maui trip, Malcolm and Vanessa were invited to participate in a documentary about racial discrimination in luxury hospitality. The documentary, produced by a black filmmaker named Aisha Robinson, was part of a larger project examining how racism persisted in industries and spaces that claimed to be post-racial, that prided themselves on meritocracy and equal access. Aisha wanted to include the Barrett story as a case study, and she wanted to film not just interviews, but also a return to the Majestic Shores resort, to see how the place had changed, to document the reforms, and to assess whether they had been sustained. Malcolm and Vanessa agreed to participate, though the idea of returning to Maui, to that resort, filled them with a complex mix of emotions. They were curious about what they would find, whether the place that had caused them so much pain had genuinely transformed, or whether the changes had been superficial, temporary, designed to weather the storm of bad publicity rather than to address underlying issues. They flew to Maui with Aisha and her crew, and they approached the majestic Shores Resort with cameras rolling. The lobby looked the same, the polished marble and the soaring ceilings and the fountain with its koi fish. But the staff had changed. The faces at the front desk were different, and when Malcolm approached to identify himself, the response was immediate and warm. The staff knew who they were, recognized them from the story, and greeted them not with suspicion, but with what seemed like genuine respect and even gratitude. The current general manager, a black woman named Keisha Tremaine, who had been brought in as part of the reforms, met with Malcolm and Vanessa in the same conference room where they had met with Richard Caldwell years earlier. Keisha was in her early 40s, with a background in hospitality management and a reputation for implementing strong diversity and inclusion programs. She spoke candidly about the challenges of changing the resort's culture, about the resistance she had encountered from some staff and guests, about the ongoing work of training and accountability. "I won't lie to you," Keisha said, her voice steady and honest. "This place had a culture of discrimination that was deeply embedded. Some of it was overt, some of it was subtle, but it was there. And changing that has been hard. We've had to let some people go, people who weren't willing to adapt, who couldn't or wouldn't see guests of color as equally deserving of respect and service. We've had to overhaul our training, our policies, our hiring practices. And even now, 5 years later, we're still working on it. It's not perfect, we still get complaints, we still have incidents, but we're better than we were, and we're committed to continuing to improve." Malcolm appreciated the honesty, the acknowledgement that change was a process rather than a destination. He asked Keisha about the oversight mechanisms, about whether the independent review board was still active, about whether the company was still publishing its diversity reports. "Yes," Keisha said, "the review board is still in place and they're tough. They don't let us slide, they don't accept excuses. And the reports are published every year, and they include detailed breakdowns of guest satisfaction by race, staff diversity by role, and complaint resolution rates. It's all public, and it holds us accountable." Vanessa asked about the staff, about whether employees of color felt supported, whether there were pathways to leadership, whether the culture had shifted in ways that went beyond policies on paper. "It's getting better," Keisha said. "We have more people of color in management now, and we've created mentorship programs and leadership development tracks. We've also implemented a whistleblower protection policy so staff can report discrimination without fear of retaliation. But I'd be lying if I said everyone feels safe and valued. We still have work to do, especially around the experiences of our housekeeping and maintenance staff, who are predominantly people of color and who often feel invisible or undervalued. That's one of my priorities, making sure that all our staff, not just those in guest-facing roles, are treated with dignity." The interview was filmed, and it became one of the centerpieces of the documentary. Aisha also interviewed other guests, both black and white, asking about their experiences at the resort and whether they had noticed changes. The responses were mixed. Some black guests reported positive experiences, said they felt welcomed and respected, that the service had been excellent. Others said they had still encountered microaggressions, moments where they felt they were being watched more closely or treated with less warmth than white guests. The documentary did not offer easy answers or a redemptive arc where everything was fixed. Instead, it showed the complexity of institutional change, the ways that progress was uneven and incomplete, the reality that dismantling systems of bias required sustained effort and vigilance. It also showed the impact that individual stories, like the Barretts, could have in forcing institutions to confront their practices and commit to reform. The documentary premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and was later picked up by a major streaming platform. It was widely viewed, praised for its nuance and its refusal to simplify the issues, and it sparked renewed conversations about discrimination in luxury hospitality and in other industries that served the wealthy. Malcolm and Vanessa watched the premiere from their home in Seattle, surrounded by friends and family. When their section of the documentary played, showing the footage from the original Maui trip and the interviews they had done for the film, Malcolm felt a wave of emotion, the memories of that week flooding back with a vividness that surprised him. He remembered the anger and the exhaustion, and the sense of being othered in a place where they should have belonged, but he also remembered the decision to fight back, the choice to speak out, the solidarity they had found in the process. After the screening, Zoe, now 22 and working at her non-profit, turned to her parents and said, "I'm proud of you for doing this, for not letting it go, for using what happened to make things better. Malcolm felt the tears prick at his eyes, felt the weight of his daughter's words. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot." And if you have stayed with this story, if you have walked with the Barrett family through the indignity and the anger, and the long, slow work of demanding accountability, then you know that this is not just their story. It is a story about all of us, about the choices we make when we encounter injustice, about the courage it takes to speak out, and about the solidarity that sustains us in the fight. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think or feel or see something differently, then carry it with you. Share it with others. Let it be part of the conversations you have about justice and equity and the kind of world we want to build. Because stories like this matter, and they grow stronger when more people hear them and decide to add their voices to the chorus demanding change. The years continued to unfold, bringing new challenges and new victories. The hospitality industry, like many industries, was slow to change, resistant to reforms that challenged long-standing practices and assumptions. But the pressure continued, from guests, from advocates, from employees, and the needle moved, incrementally but undeniably. Malcolm and Vanessa remained involved in the work, though as time passed, they shifted from being at the center of the story to being supporters and amplifiers of others' stories. They mentored families who were going through similar experiences, connected them with attorneys and advocates, and used their resources to fund organizations working on systemic reform. They also took time to focus on their own lives, their own family, finding moments of joy and rest amid the ongoing work of advocacy. Zoe launched a project at her nonprofit, a database of discrimination complaints in the hospitality industry that allowed people to report incidents and track patterns across companies and properties. The database became a valuable resource for advocates, journalists, and attorneys, and it helped to surface stories that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. She credited her parents' experience as the inspiration for the project, and she dedicated it to all the families who had been profiled, dismissed, or made to feel they did not belong. Marcus, now in college, was studying law with a focus on civil rights. He talked about wanting to follow in the footsteps of Sandra Williams, the attorney who had represented his family, and to use the law as a tool for justice. He was thoughtful, principled, driven by a sense of purpose that had been forged in that Maui lobby years earlier, and Malcolm and Vanessa, looking back on the journey, felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for what had happened, but for what they had learned, for the ways they had grown, for the impact they had been able to make. They knew that the fight was not over, that there would always be more work to do, more systems to challenge, more stories to tell. But they also knew that they had played their part, that they had contributed to something larger than themselves, and that the world was, in some small but meaningful way, better because they had refused to stay silent. One evening, sitting on their deck overlooking Puget Sound, the water calm and the sky streaked with the colors of sunset, Vanessa turned to Malcolm and said, "Do you ever think about what our lives would have been like if that trip had gone differently, if we'd been treated the way we should have been from the start?" Malcolm considered the question, thought about the alternate timeline where they had checked in smoothly, enjoyed a relaxing vacation, and returned home with nothing more than photos and good memories. "Sometimes," he said, "but I don't think I'd change it. What we went through was hard, but it also gave us purpose. It showed us what we could do, how we could use our voice and our platform, and it brought us closer, as a family, as people. So no, I don't think I'd change it." Vanessa nodded, leaned her head on his shoulder. "Me neither." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky, and thought about the years ahead, the challenges and opportunities that would come, the ways they would continue to contribute to the work of building a more just world. The Maui trip had been a turning point, a moment that had defined them and shaped their path. But it was not the end of their story. It was a chapter, a significant one, but only one of many. And as the stars began to appear above the water, Malcolm and Vanessa Barrett felt at peace, knowing that they had fought the good fight, that they had made a difference, and that the story would continue, carried forward by the people they had inspired, the systems they had changed, and the world they had helped to make a little bit more just. The documentary about the Barrett family's experience and the broader issues of discrimination in luxury hospitality was released to critical acclaim, winning awards and sparking conversations that rippled through boardrooms, conferences, and living rooms across the country. It was used in training programs for hospitality workers, in college courses on social justice and business ethics, in diversity and inclusion workshops at major corporations. The story had transcended the individuals at its center, becoming a case study in how systems of power and privilege operated, how they could be challenged, and what it took to create lasting change. But for the Barretts, the most meaningful impact was not in the awards or the recognition. It was in the messages they received from other families, from people who had watched the documentary and seen themselves reflected in it, who had been inspired to speak out about their own experiences, who had found the courage to demand accountability. It was in the policy changes at resorts and hotels across the country, the ones that cited the Barrett case as a catalyst. It was in the young people, like Zoe and Marcus, who had been shaped by the experience and who were now carrying the work forward in their own ways. 10 years after the Maui trip, the Barrett family returned to Hawaii, but this time to a different island, a different resort, one that had been recommended by friends who had themselves been welcomed and respected. The vacation was everything they had hoped for a decade earlier, relaxing, joyful, unmarred by suspicion or profiling. They spent their days exploring the island, swimming in clear water, sharing meals and laughter, and the kind of easy intimacy that comes from years of navigating challenges together. On their last evening, they gathered on the beach for a family photo. Zoe set up her phone on a tripod, set the timer, and ran back to join them. They stood together, arms around each other, smiling as the sun set behind them. And when the camera captured the moment, it was not just a photo of a family on vacation. It was a photo of survival, of resilience, of a family that had refused to be diminished by the assumptions and biases of others, that had fought back and won, that had used their pain to create something meaningful. And when Zoe posted the photo to social media, she wrote, "10 years ago we took a family vacation that became something else entirely. We were profiled, dismissed, made to feel like we didn't belong, but we didn't stay silent. We fought back and we helped change the conversation about who deserves access to luxury, to rest, to dignity. This trip, we were just a family on vacation, and that's progress. But the work isn't done. Keep telling your stories, keep demanding accountability, keep fighting for a world where everyone belongs." The post was shared thousands of times, and the comments were full of gratitude, solidarity, and stories from people who had been inspired by the Barrett's courage. And reading those comments, sitting on the beach with his family around him, Malcolm Barrett felt a profound sense of fulfillment, not because the world was fixed, not because racism had been eradicated, but because they had played their part, had contributed to the slow, difficult, essential work of bending the arc of history toward justice. The story of the Barrett family did not end with a neat resolution or a triumphant victory. It ended, as all real stories do, in the middle of things, with work still to be done, progress still to be made, systems still to be challenged. But it ended with a family that had survived, that had grown stronger, that had used their experience to make the world a little bit better for those who came after them. And that, in the end, was enough.